Hello, everyone. I'm Angela Davis, and welcome to the Weisman Art Museum in Minneapolis for our second conversation about how to revitalize local news, an event NPR News is hosting with Report for America. Our first conversation was about philanthropy leaders, and it was with philanthropy leaders who are focused on creating new systems for local news to thrive. If you missed it, you can find that on our website, nprnews.org, or on my podcast. Just search for NPR News with Angela Davis. But right now, we're going to jump into our second discussion, which is with local journalists themselves. Each of the panelists I'm about to introduce plays a key role in reshaping how Minnesota communities stay informed. So first, next to me, I have my friend Chao Zhang. Chao is now the editorial director of Sahan Journal, and that is a nonprofit digital newsroom that was started 5 years ago and focuses on immigrant and communities of color in Minnesota. Welcome, Chao.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. Next to him is Steve Grove. Steve is the CEO and publisher of the Star Tribune, the largest newspaper in Minnesota. Hi, Steve. Glad you're here.
Thanks, Angela.
Hi. We also have Nora Hurdle with us. Nora is the founder and executive director of Project Optimus. Now, that is a digital news startup based in St. Michael, Minnesota, that does solutions-oriented journalism across greater Minnesota, and we'll define solutions-oriented journalism more in a few minutes. Hi, Nora.
Hi, thank you so much.
Hi, nice to see you. And next to Nora, we have Georgia Fort. Georgia is an independent journalist who left legacy media to cover equity in the Twin Cities outside of the traditional forms of media. Hi, Georgia. We're so excited to have you with us as well.
Hi, Angela. Excited to be here.
And finally there we have Chelsea Perkins. Chelsea, who recently traded 15 years of experience in print journalism for what? Radio. The newly created news director job at KAXE Radio in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. Congratulations. And welcome, Chelsea.
Thank you.
So Chelsea, I will begin with you because before we get to the solutions, I want to spend some time describing the problem. Now, you are intimately acquainted with local news, the crisis that we're seeing across Minnesota, but give us a snapshot of your personal story as you pursued a career in journalism, and I understand you grew up in Brainerd.
I did, yes, the Brainerd Lakes area, Cross Lake represent. And so I spent the first, 9 years at a local daily newspaper, moved back home, actually, to cover news at home after trying to find a job around here, just wasn't finding the right fit. And working in that newsroom, I really fell in love with local news and also had the opportunity to cover the place I grew up and learn things about the place I grew up that I'd never even known as a child and a teen who wanted to get the heck out of there originally. But now I'm home. I've been home for 10 years, and the day that I went to KAXE to interview for this position, I came back to my newspaper newsroom and found out that our staff had been slashed in half. It was a strangely poetic and devastating moment because I was already feeling a little bit scared and apprehensive about leaving the newspaper field in a newspaper that I loved so much, the Brainerd Dispatch. And I took it as a sign that I needed to take on this role to help strengthen local news for my home and for my neighbors. And so that's what we're trying to do.
So I have here in my notes that the Blandin Foundation gave seed money to KAXE to hire a news director and 2 reporters. So tell me about that.
Yeah, so KAXE is the oldest rural community radio station in the United States, almost 50 years old.
Oh, wow.
But it had never had an actual dedicated newsroom. So the Blandin Foundation saw the need in the community. They saw the emerging news deserts that I also saw happening right before my eyes. And they said, we need to invest in this. And they looked at KAXE, which was already a well-loved community institution that had airwaves across almost the entire northern half of the state. And they said, this is where we can start. And so That's what they did. They gave KAXE a grant to get this off the ground, and we all kind of took a leap together to see how we could shape this project.
And how have people in the community responded to this new focus on news now?
We have had incredibly positive reception. We've been getting so many positive comments from people who, tell us that they didn't know this, they wouldn't have known this was happening if it weren't for our coverage. And one distinction is that we are public media. And so we don't have anything behind a paywall. We have our radio content, we have our digital content. We're providing multiple avenues for people to access this information. And a lot of the local governments that we're covering haven't had rigorous coverage for quite some time. And so we're there to keep an eye on things.
All right. And for you personally, the transition from print to radio, how is that going for you?
I'm feeling a little more comfy with this thing now, this microphone.
It doesn't bite.
It doesn't bite. It took me a little while to find my voice and to feel less stilted. And one major difference between the newspaper world and the radio world is I feel like in the newspaper world, we do our best to slink in the shadows as reporters. And when you're on the radio, you are sharing your personality. You're talking about who you are and why, your work is important to the community and how you're part of that community as well. And so it's taken me a little bit of time to get into the groove of being Chelsea Perkins, an approachable human being and not this newspaper reporter in the corner.
Well, congratulations on the new job.
Thank you.
Nora, you also want to give voice to more rural communities. So tell us how Project Optimus is filling the local news gap. I love the name, by the way.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Project Optimus serves Greater Minnesota. I started my career in Minnesota at the St. Cloud Times. St. Cloud has lost a lot of reporters in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, there were 50 people working at the Times. Now there are 3 in the newsroom.
Say that again. The St. Cloud Times?
Yes.
It was what? And now it's what?
It was near 45 or 50 people in the early 2000s. And now there are 3 that I know of working in the newsroom. And it's hard to see that. It's a big market. And at the same time, I'm not solely focused on St. Cloud. I saw news deserts emerging across Greater Minnesota, and there are regional issues that we can cover that matter to multiple communities. So our beats are environment, which has not been covered thoroughly up to this point, business, and social issues. And we look at all of that through a solutions lens. I'm going to define solutions journalism now.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Solutions journalism is a practice within the field of journalism. It is rigorous, evidence-based reporting on responses to problems. We're not endorsing solutions. We're looking at the responses and we're interrogating them. What worked? What's the evidence? What are the limitations and insights that we can glean from those attempts? And then move forward with that. It presents a sense of possibility around problems instead of just presenting problems.
Mm-hmm. Because, a lot of people feel hopeless, and then people just sort of shut down. Right?
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Responses from your audiences?
We've done market research every year for the last 3 years, and the themes that come up every time are frustration, depression, and anger with existing news offerings. A lot of that has to do with people not getting local news and going to national sources, partisan sources. There's more negativity in national coverage. Right. There are studies that show that. And so I want to help people have a better experience with the news. We have to take into consideration how people feel when they consume our content, because if they feel bad, they're not going to read it. They're not going to watch it. They're not going to listen to it.
And local news has the power to create that connection, that human connection.
Correct. Right. Talking about people that they know, something that's happening down the street or in the next town over. Oh, somebody's already working on that problem. My tax dollars are helping work on this, or the business that I've that I stop at on my way to my lake house, they're involved in this. We need to see that there's progress or attempted progress on some of the big challenges that we've got.
Thank you for the work you're doing.
Thanks.
Steve, the Star Tribune is the paper of record in Minnesota. And like NPR, you're also working to do a better job of covering the entire state. I know you've been doing a series of listening sessions this year in communities across Minnesota. So what are you hearing?
Yeah, well, we're hearing a lot of pride, quite frankly. I think Minnesotans are really proud of being from Minnesota. I say this as someone who grew up in Northfield, left for a long time, was living in Silicon Valley, and I feel like whenever I'd bump into a Minnesotan, you meet somebody who was just really proud of being from Minnesota. It was like the Minnesotans and the Texans were the most proud people you would meet of their state.
Sure.
And so when we hit the road in Minnesota and talking to local communities, I don't think you would know that there was so much strife and polarization when you talk to people about their actual town or their city. That's been really encouraging to see, and why I think Project Optimism is so fascinating. There's a lot of good stories out there to tell that can connect our communities and help us feel some pride for this moment at a time when, frankly, there's a lot of challenge too. We're also hearing consistently that Minnesotans, I think unique again to that state identity, want to hear what's happening in other parts of the state. People in Rochester really care what's happening in Duluth. People in Warroad really care what's happening in Mankato. And our data shows us that too. When the Star Tribune will publish a piece from a particular city, it's not only the ISPs within that sort of short radius that view those articles, they're viewed across the state. So our bet is that Minnesota, as a place that has a unique identity, wants to know more about what's happening across the state. If we can hire more reporters across Minnesota that can lift up more coverage, certainly not replace local and hyper-local news organizations, but share a statewide perspective of what's happening, we think it's good for our business, and we think it's good for the future of our state.
And what has been the response to the listening sessions? I mean, when you get there, are people like, what are you doing here? Are they expecting you all to actually travel and be present with them?
I think there's a little surprise. I mean, the Star Tribune has long been known as a newspaper of the Twin Cities, and so people are like, oh, we kind of thought you guys were like the Minneapolis paper, and that's probably a deserved reputation. In fact, at one time, that actually was our tagline. We see a broader ambition to cover more of the state. I would also say, and we've talked here about the demand for local news and that being a challenge, I hear everywhere people want fact-based, objective information about where they live. The economics of it we need to figure out, but there's not like suddenly America woke up one day and said, I don't really want to know the truth anymore. No, people do want to know what's happening in their communities, and so that gives me hope that if we can get the business model right and land this in a great way, there's a huge demand for fact-based information, and that can improve our democracy.
Star Tribune, you all have been writing about yourselves. The Star Tribune recently announced a reorganization within the newsroom, new editors, new departments. I mean, how does that fit in with this goal of finding new ways to make journalism sustainable?
Yeah, we're going through a bit of a reboot right now. We are trying to operate as a company that has the heads of technologists and the hearts of journalists. Our Chief Product Officer, Aaron Pillhofer, is here tonight. He's helping us really reimagine our platform and how it works. We think Minnesota deserves a modern digital media company that has a newsroom of the size that we have, over 200 journalists at the Star Tribune. That's actually more journalists in our newsroom than any other newsroom in the entire Midwest, including Chicago. So it's a great asset that we have to have in the state, but we have to be able to deliver our content to people in great ways. But then, of course, it all comes back to the journalism and the newsroom and how we focus our content. We've done a lot of research on what types of content Minnesotans find most interesting and useful, where we think we can deliver the most value. And some of those things are very obviously local, news and politics, food and culture, and sports. But then there's some kind of unique Minnesota categories. So the outdoors is something we're going to invest a lot in. Obviously, this is a state where we love our 10,000 lakes. We love to get out there and enjoy Minnesota. And we think that's an area we can lean into. And then business. This is a Fortune 500 capital of the country. More Fortune 500 businesses here per capita than any other metro area in the entire country. That's something that we should not just watchdog, but also celebrate. So I think those kind of verticals, if you will, those categories of content, we think have good business runway for us, but also are kind of who and what Minnesota is. So it's an exciting time. We're rethinking almost everything. It's a bit of a reboot for us. We're a 157-year-old newspaper, but we think we can be around 157 more years if we start thinking a little differently.
And because you're the publisher, I want to ask you this question because I'm sure this comes up a lot with people you meet, and it involves paying for the newspaper. Do you think that we have we passed the time and the day when consumers will pay for news content? When someone goes to StarTribune.com, they hit a paywall unless they have a subscription.
Yeah. I don't think we've passed that moment. I think that the market is more crowded. People can subscribe to Netflix and Disney Plus and Beer of the Month, and I subscribed to Sky Zone Trampoline Park last week for my kids. There's a subscription for everything, we know that, so it's gone are the days when it's just the Star Tribune and the Pioneer Press sort of competing for whatever subscription dollars you have. I think people want to and will pay for the news, but you mentioned the paywall. We need to have a relationship with our customers that is more akin to a Spotify or Netflix. If you hit that paywall and you're annoyed by it, your impression of us is, oh, you're blocking me from something that I want. We need a paywall. We have to have a paywall. But if we can create the kind of relationship with our customer that is warmer, more personalized, more connected, then you think about your relationship to news organization differently than simply, oh, I got to jump the paywall to get the piece of information that I want. And that requires a different approach. News organizations culturally, I think, operate on the model of a quality culture. We need quality content. We need to get the facts right. That is true. But what news organizations, I think, have lost to tech, and I say this as someone who worked at Google for most of my career and lived in this culture that was all about know your user, is we lost this culture of focusing on the customer. And it doesn't mean that we haven't been for the people. I think we are, nor that we shouldn't be focused on quality. But you've got to run a news organization like a business that focuses on your customer and what they need and meeting them where they're at. That's a cultural thing that leads to different business decisions that I think can preserve us and take advantage of that desire to pay for content or pay for things that you love. But it isn't going to be easy, because certainly there's a lot of free news out there, and though it isn't as high quality, people can find things in a lot of places. So you got to work for it.
Georgia, you left legacy media because you wanted more independence. And so describe how you're stepping into the gaps that old news models created.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Angela, I would say my journey as an independent journalist was not necessarily like something I woke up and said, hey, I want to do this. You don't go to kindergarten and ask, kindergartners what they want to be when they grow up. And people are like, I want to be an independent journalist, like maybe lawyer, doctor, fireman, firewoman. But for me, I worked in broadcasting for 10 years in different markets across the country. And like many journalists, you have to climb that ladder. You got to go to the small markets and work your way up. Being from Minnesota, which is rated, I think, like 16-ish for broadcasting. It's a bigger market. It's very, very competitive. And so when I was ready to come home for personal reasons with my husband and my family, I wasn't able to get a job here. And so I actually left the industry and started working different jobs, comms, PR, like most other retired journalists do. And I was miserable. And so it wasn't until George Floyd was murdered that I felt called to just go out into community and start telling the stories. I think at that time I may have had like an audience of 6,000 on Facebook, and I would interview people and create my news packages just like I did when I was a multimedia journalist at mainstream media newsrooms. And I remember everybody would always say, like, where can I watch this? I'm like, on Facebook. But that became this catalyst now to an audience of over 150,000 people. We reached 18 million people within 2 years of live streaming the Chauvin trial, which I was one of two journalists inside the courtroom when he was sentenced. We also live streamed the Kimberly Potter trial. And so what I learned from that was there was this huge need for an alternative. And I kind of like to think about it as like complementary, right? Like the work I do as an independent journalist is not going to replace traditional news outlets. But quite frankly, the Black community and a lot of brown and other diverse communities have had to sit down and watch a newscast, which 90% or 95% or sometimes 100% does not reflect them. And so I think we were able to offer our community a place where they could go and 100% see themselves represented. And people fell in love with that, being able to hear from officials who looked like them, to be able to hear from experts who looked like them, and then to be able to hear from other peers and colleagues who also looked like them as well.
And the fact that your audience has grown and the fact that you've won awards for your reporting, that shows that there is an interest and a thirst, that there are people who felt like they're not seeing their stories in other media.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that this market has definitely moved forward. I think that I made a case that these types of stories are palatable. And so what I've observed is like the influence that that has had on other stations, whether they hire more diverse reporters or whether they create new segments or series that are focused on race and culture, or whether they hire street reporters, which was a thing that you never heard of. And I think 5 and 10 years ago, street reporting was considered like fringe, and now folks are seeing the value in how.
Describe street reporting. What is that?
Well, just being more in community, on the ground. MOS, I think, is probably what you would call it.
Like man on the street interviews.
Yeah, and so taking that type of reporting and distributing it directly to TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, these social platforms, you're able to reach a much younger audience that traditional news outlets are not catering to.
Chow, as the editor of a news organization that covers immigrant and communities of color, Sahan Journal, I'm sure a lot of this sounds familiar. Legacy media has a track record of not covering all communities equally. And how does that factor in what you're doing now at Sahan Journal?
Yeah, I think at Sahan, well, first I have to confess that as a longtime newspaper reporter and new editor, I'm still lurking in the shadows, so you have to bear with me tonight. I think at Sahan, that really starts with building a newsroom and a staff that's more reflective of the community than you see in legacy media. Mm-hmm. Our editorial staff is about 57% people of color. Our staff in general, which including sales and other departments.
And I should mention, you were a longtime reporter at the Star Tribune.
Yes, that's correct.
What was it like in terms of diversity when you were at the Star Tribune?
I don't remember the numbers, but it would fluctuate quite a bit, and I think it was hard to retain some of the younger journalists of color who maybe felt called to go back to their home
But
state.
predominantly white
cities.
when you were
Correct,
there,
yes,
right?
that's right, yeah. So that's where it starts with us, is really building a diverse newsroom where people bring their lived experiences to the table to identify stories early on that matter to the community, to act fast, to cover stories. And I think a good example is, when the local Hmong activist Tuzher Xiong was killed in Colombia, Sahan was the first to kind of get that story out there. That eventually became a national story very quickly. And I think other media maybe were a little bit slower to follow that story and kind of identify that as something that really did matter to not just the Hmong community, but the broader community in Minnesota too.
I'm a Sahan Journal fan, but I've been really impressed with how you all have been able to get your content out on social media. Could you speak to that and the value of that?
Yes, I think part of that benefit is really having a young staff too that we lean on for expertise about kind of the shifting shape of journalism and the future of journalism. We have a pretty strong presence on Instagram and TikTok, and what we're seeing is that there's not necessarily a decline in the interest of news. It's that our audience is meeting us somewhere else, and they're looking for that news to be delivered in a different mode.
We have to go where they are.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see, the TikTok version of a written story get 20,000, 80,000, 200,000 views on Instagram. It doesn't quite match the views on the website, and that gap is, kind of a challenge to bridge financially for us. And I think it's not that there's a disinterest in news; it's that it's just moving somewhere else, and we haven't quite found a way to monetize that content on those new platforms.
This panel is also about partnerships, and so. One of those new models that we've been talking about. And so what kind of partnerships has Sahan found to be most useful?
Yeah. I think Sahan has really built some strong partnerships with local media like Minnesota Public Radio and the Star Tribune, where we do content sharing. And that's kind of one part and one kind of partnership. And there's a spectrum of that. We have also done pretty in-depth co-reporting and co-writing with other news outlets, including ProPublica. There was a pretty successful partnership in 2022 with our reporter Joey Peters and the local ProPublica reporter Jessica Lussenhop on the contract for deed home sales. We're still seeing the impact of that even a few years after the story ran in 2022, with lawmakers on the federal and state level this year introducing legislation to reform that practice. And then the Attorney General's office also opening an investigation into contract for deed sales.
And how does that work, partnerships? Is it awkward or each partnership is different? I mean,
they're all different.
Someone wants to always lead, right?
Yes, I mean, they definitely can be awkward, but I think overall what you see is that there's a benefit and that we all kind of lift each other up through that partnership. We're not kind of taking from each other, through that partnership. I think it's just a matter of being kind of diplomatic and sometimes, knowing when to kind of give ground to someone else, not always trying to get your way, and kind of seeing the bigger picture instead of kind of the individual
Right.
benefit of that.
Because I feel like we there's room for all of us. We need all types of news media. And Georgia, you also work, with partnerships. What has that experience been like for you, trying to partner with other organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the problem that I'm trying to solve is so large. I feel like it needs a lot of different solutions. Like not one thing is going to fix it. And so there's kind of been two approaches that I've taken. I have a company that's partnered with networks like CW Twin Cities to produce a TV news program that was nominated for 6 Emmys. We won 2. It has 100% diverse staff to show like this can be done. And we've told stories that impact communities of color. And so that has been a really phenomenal partnership. And we're actually exploring new partnerships with other networks locally and nationally, which is exciting. And then on the other side, because of the experiences that I had with trying to gain employment in this market as a journalist of color, a Black journalist, a biracial journalist, really focused and committed to telling diverse stories. The other aspect is investing in workforce development. And so I have a nonprofit that I co-founded with Marianne Combs. And our effort is to really invest in the next generation of journalists. And so we've partnered with Ramsey County Workforce Development to be able to equip 10 journalists with their own camera, their own audio recorder, their own microphone, their own laptop, pay them to go through
How old are they?
training.
What's the age range?
17 to 24.
Okay.
And then after that, we're partnering with local newsrooms like Star Tribune and Pioneer Press and Spokesman Recorder to create internship opportunities so that they can actually go into the workforce and see what it's like. And then build those connections so hopefully that they can get jobs in the future. And I think that has been an aspect of the problem that we're all trying to solve that has really been underinvested in. Because when you think about that pipeline, right? Newsrooms all the time are saying, hey, we're just not getting the diverse candidates. We don't have a strong pool of Black and brown journalists who want to work here. And so we're investing in that pipeline to be able to have a really strong workforce to pull from. And then ultimately, some of these young people may not go into journalism, but maybe they'll be producers. Maybe they'll be the next independent journalist who's doing it on their own. And so at least we're equipping more people who look like you and me to go out and tell stories authentically.
Mm-hmm. And storytelling, I mean, that's a skill that you can really apply to many different professions. So
Absolutely.
that's wonderful. Chelsea, KAXE is doing something new in addition to making the wonderful decision of hiring you. Thanks to support from funders like Press Forward and the Blandin Foundation, what other revenue sources are you looking at, and what's your current model for news?
Well, all of them, all of the revenue, please.
Come to your revenue friendly. Okay.
Right. So we understand, the conversation you had with the funders earlier really brought to light the fact of sustainability. And right now we're operating on seed money, and we're fully aware of that. But we also have seen increased support in our membership, in our business sponsorship as well. And that's noticeable. It's a noticeable increase in support from our community that's showing that they are appreciating the work that we're doing and the way that we're stretching ourselves. As far as the news model, well, that's, a work in progress. I've never started a newsroom before, and it's been an interesting experience.
Tell me about the success you have had with getting business sponsorships. Is it you meeting personally with people, or what seems to be working there?
Well, we have a development director that was hired around the same time as me. In fact, our staff is all pretty new. We have some folks who've been there for quite a long time, and then a mix of fresh faces. Our staff has grown. It's a rarity, I've noticed, in the public radio world to be saying that to folks, but it's
What was
true.
the sentence? You said your staff has
Grown.
Grown?
Yes. I did
That's
say that,
happening.
Angela.
All right.
Yes. And we are all really mission-driven people and have Chris is a very personable person, Chris Walker, our development director, and he's been able to really get a lot of people on board. We just recently added a new sponsor for our daily newscast, which is also a podcast, and we've really invested
Wonderful.
in digital
Yeah.
as well. Spent a lot of time really working on our website, making sure that the great content that we're putting on the air that we know is not accessible to everyone. And not everyone knows we stream online. Not everyone has a radio, and we know how people are consuming news nowadays. And we've really put a lot of emphasis on the digital presence, which I think business supporters and members have noticed as well.
Nora, what other types of partners would you like to see engage in this work? I'm thinking maybe community elders, educators, maybe more local businesses.
Yeah, so right now we have partnered already with community organizations. We've hosted dialogues with organizations that are already involved in their communities. So Engage Winona, Conexiones in Morris. And we've had partnerships with other news organizations as well. So sharing content, starting talks to collaborate, moving into the future. And I do think that there's a lot of room for collaboration across community, across with libraries. Our future definitely holds some work in media literacy, and librarians in schools are going to be a big part of that.
Steve, news organizations, traditionally we've viewed each other as competition, particularly when I worked in television, like competition was real. So it sounds like we really need to switch that view to be more collaborative. Is that even possible for legacy media to collaborate? Although I have to tell you, Chow and I, we collaborated a few times covering things.
It's possible, yeah.
Right? It's nice when someone kind of has your back, but is that realistic to expect?
It better be. I think you can do both. Competition's good. Teams want to beat each other out for the scoop. They want to be first to a story. They want to get the big
First
the big
and fast,
investigative piece. Yeah,
right.
that matters, and I think you want that in the market. You don't want to lose that. But I think partnership is actually really, really critical. And for us, as we think about our expansion into greater Minnesota, we think that's actually essential. I mean, if we're going to come to St. Cloud or Mankato or Rochester or Duluth and expand our reporting footprint, we want to do it in partnership with local news organizations, not just sharing content, which I think is really important, but what about bundling subscriptions? An incremental digital subscription does not cost us much more. It's the economy of the internet is different. If we can bundle that with a local newspaper subscription, and offer a different price point for someone in greater Minnesota, it might not get quite the same amount of local coverage from us, but certainly that statewide view helps. I think that's a really encouraging model to think through. And so I think it's really critical. I think content sharing as well just gives us a different lens and window into what's happening across the state. And I think it's powerful. I don't think I've seen any state get this quite right. You've seen it in a few places. I think Minnesota could actually be the leading model for local news partnerships in the country if we work together.
So as this conversation airs on the radio, you all have an opportunity right now to speak to listeners across Minnesota. So a question for everybody. If you could say something to funders and community leaders about supporting local news, what would it be? What would you, as people are listening, what would you want them to know about the value of supporting local news and the necessity of it? Chelsea?
Well, I have come to believe that news should be viewed as a public utility. Having previously been in the private sphere and now being in the public sphere, there's been some mind shifts I've had myself as far as the fact that I do believe that everyone deserves access to good information, and rural people deserve to see themselves reflected in their coverage. And we have the opportunity in our space to experiment, try new things. We're a small shop, and so we can try the ways to reach people the best we can. And I really just think that, those who can afford to pay and who appreciate the value of local news and information should absolutely do so, because there are folks who cannot, and they deserve that information as well.
And Georgia, what would you want funders and community leaders to know about the importance of supporting local news?
You know, I would encourage people to close their eyes and imagine, you know, what it's like to sit down and watch a 30-minute newscast and not see yourself reflected at all. Imagine that, you know, gut feeling you get when you walk into a room and you're the only one. And that type of isolation that you feel is what people in Black and brown communities have been feeling when they turn on the TV, when they turn on the radio, when they pick up the newspaper for a really long time. And I was so energized in 2020 when there was this huge, you know, rally around diversity and supporting equity for Black and brown communities. And like truly that moment has passed. And we have seen, especially in the media space, and this is necessary, but it's just true, right? Like the conversation has now, and the energy has shifted to focusing on media in rural communities. And we need to do that. But we also need to have a really like honest conversation with ourselves about, did we solve the last big problem? And if we didn't solve the last big problem, what are we doing? Are we just abandoning that and then moving on to the next thing? And so I know that there has been a lot of support in 2020, 2021, and maybe even to 2022 to different Black media outlets specifically. And where are those outlets now? Where's that support now? And if the solution hasn't been brought forth or found, if we still are thinking about sustainability for diverse coverage, what are we doing? And so I would just encourage people to think about that, how it feels to be isolated and to know that we have a lot of diverse communities that feel that every single day, that don't see themselves reflected. And to me, I think when you think about investing in journalism, that is really, really important to invest in, just like rural communities and making sure that they have coverage.
Nora, what do you want people to know?
I want people to know that journalism is not going to go back to the way that it used to be. It's not going to look like it used to look, and it's going to be messy getting to a future for our field. I also want people to know that it's a really hard time for journalism, and it's a really hard time for us in so many different ways. It's really a historic moment for all of us because of inequities that we are trying to address and maybe have fallen off the radar in the last couple years, because of issues that are internal, like social isolation, deaths of despair. And then, of course, we're in the middle of a climate crisis. This is a historic moment, and we need journalism to bring people together and present possibilities so that we can take on those incredibly large challenges. We have to take them on together.
Steve, this is the ultimate listening session. What do you want people to know about supporting local news?
Well, a lot of people listening right now might not like news media all that much these days. Certainly the survey data would show us that trust in media is at an all-time low. And when you look at the national media in particular, I think people are kind of exhausted by the ways in which media polarizes us. I would encourage people to think about local differently. Local media is different than national media. And investing in local media is investing in the very community that you live in. You know, we and our families and our community are product of the neighborhoods that we live in. And local news and local journalism help strengthen those communities. And so when you think about the value proposition, yes, it's high quality, fact-based information, but it's also investment in the very ground on which you walk, which is really what we're all here to do, is to improve our communities. So I think I would encourage people to think about local differently than maybe national, and think of the unique role local news plays in strengthening your own neighborhood.
Yeah, I think about local reporters. We talk about this on NPR News. Like, we live here too. I had a foot of snow last night too. I'm right in here with you, right? You know, and our kids are going to, you know, schools here too. Like, we have this connection. We share the experience of being Minnesotans with you, and that there is great value in that. Chow, anything you want people to know?
Yeah, two things. I think one is to reiterate my earlier points. People still crave information. They're just getting it elsewhere now. So we need that philanthropy support so that we can still continue to do our work until we find a way to monetize those other platforms. And the second thing I would say, and this sounds so old-fashioned, is that you should support local journalism because it's still making a difference and uncovering truths that are being hidden from you. And someone in the previous panel said, journalists are terrible at explaining what we do and kind of bragging about ourselves. So I'm going to take a minute to brag about Sahan Journal. Last fall, our climate reporter, Andrew Hazard, broke a story about how Smith Foundry in South Minneapolis, in one of the most diverse neighborhoods, had been belching toxic fumes for years in this neighborhood. This was information that was known by the federal government, it was known by state regulators, and neither of those entities shared this with the public. It took a story from a local reporter to really expose that for years this foundry had been running with all these violations. And I think that's why people support local journalism.
Right, it's important. Okay, in our remaining time, I want to get in one question from one of our audience members here, and it's advice that someone is seeking. You all have deep roots in Minnesota. What do newcomers need to learn to do ethical journalism? I have, worked in like 7 newsrooms around the country, and when you come into a community, you're like, okay, where am I? It takes time to learn the culture of a community and develop sources. So any advice for newcomers, new journalists to a community to be successful so that they can contribute to their newsrooms? Chelsea?
Well, I would say that the most important thing is just to get out there in the community.
Like go meet people and go do things.
Exactly. Be part of it. And that includes volunteering. That includes participating in civic organizations. That includes, actually being involved in your church, being involved in the various ways that we're going to keep the fabric of civic society together. And you also are going to meet so many people who are going to lead you to so many more people. And eventually you'll have so many sources and story ideas, you won't know what to do.
But people should know those are real conversations that happen when new reporters are hired, that they are encouraged to get out there. Georgia, any advice for someone who's dropped into a new state and asked to cover it?
Well, yeah, I think everything that Chelsea hit on was spot on. And for us, that's part of the reason why we focused in developing a workforce locally. Because no matter like how much you get out there, when you go into a community you're not from, there's just context that you're going to be missing. There is political things that have happened leading up to where we are today. You're not really going to have that nuance because you weren't here, you didn't live it. And so I truly think part of the key to transforming journalism and local journalism is figuring out a way to employ the journalists who are from the communities in which they're serving because they have that lived experience. The passion that a reporter would have for the Rondo Land Bridge, for example, is going to be very different if their grandparent or a former neighbor or a colleague actually lost a home during the construction of that interstate, right? And so I think that when you're from a community, you have way greater contacts just naturally based on proximity, and you have a context and a history to what's happened in neighborhoods that transplants are never going to grasp. You're just never going to learn that. And so I would agree with everything she said, but also add to that's part of what the problem is. We expect people to move across the country and work somewhere that they're not familiar, they know no one, they're disconnected from their family in isolation, and that also creates a barrier to enter the field. And so then journalism kind of becomes this elitist profession that's only afforded to the people who can get over those barriers.
Nora, what do you think is important for newcomers to communities to understand?
I think a lot of reporters are good listeners. We have to listen to people and integrate what they say into our stories. But I think there's another kind of listening after the story comes out, whether it went well, whether it was received well, or whether there's criticism coming back. And journalists get a lot of criticism, but I think some of it is well-deserved. And we need to be able to listen to that and listen to people and not respond. Just listen to them. Just take it in and let them say their piece.
Right. Steve, as you hire new folks from other places, what do you want them to know to maintain the standards that the Star Tribune has?
Well, I think first of all, when you think about Minnesota, whether you're a journalist or not, newcomers will hear pretty quickly the phrase that if you want to make a friend in Minnesota, go to kindergarten here. There's Minnesota Nice, which is kind of the passive-aggressive piece, and there's Minnesota Ice, which is it is kind of hard to crack through some of our social structures here. I think the first advice is just to keep on pushing, like Minnesotans do, are welcoming people. It just might take a little bit more effort up front. In the news space, I mean, I'll give you an example. Next week, actually, we have a new opinion editor starting at the Star Tribune, a big new
A new
job
editor
us.
for what?
A new opinion editor.
Opinion
His name
editor.
is Phil Morris. He's coming to us from Cleveland, black leader there who's never lived in Minnesota before, but he's going to come in and run the state's most important opinion pages. And one of the reasons that we're so excited for him to come is he brings fresh eyes. And I think for any journalist, whether you're on the opinion side or the news side, coming into Minnesota with a fresh pair of eyes is a superpower. And you can help our state examine itself and tackle some of the challenges that George and others here have brought up and not try to go too native too quick. I actually think being an outsider in the market is a really special gift that we at the Star Tribune want to see more of. We want more people from outside the state coming in to do this work because there's that kind of outsider status you have to have as a journalist to be good. And I think it's a powerful addition in any newsroom to lean into that.
As a transplant myself, I spend a lot of time asking, why? Who?
Yeah.
But then you often will get responses from people. They will dig a little harder to explain something, and that can be valuable in storytelling. Chow?
One thing I always tell journalists and students when I speak to them is show up for your beat, show up for your story, and show up for their readers. Today, it's very easy to pick up a phone call and ask a PIO to send you a police report. You should drive over there, file that request manually, and figure out how the systems work. Because if you're not doing that, you don't know when they're broken. And that's what I think people need to do is show up to school board meetings, show up to community meetings. And part of the problem is no one gives out an award for best coverage of a school board meeting, but they should, because that's where life
That
happens
would
for
be
our
great,
readers.
right,
Yeah.
right. And just, again, the value of that. And then once you develop those sources, then they give you great ideas. All right, well, our time is up. I want to thank our panelists, and thank you to our audience as well. Again, we have to leave it here, but the stories that you all are doing, the work that you're doing in Minnesota, I'm grateful for each of you, and I'm glad that we are all in partnership. We're on the same team because we're trying to make sure that these standards of journalism are upheld, and we see the value of local news. So thank you personally. Once again, we've been talking with Chao Zhang, the editorial director of Sahan Journal, Steve Grove, the publisher and CEO of the Star Tribune, Nora Hurdle, the founder and executive director of Project Optimist, Georgia Fort, an independent journalist whose work can be found at georgiafort.com, and Chelsea Perkins, news director at KAXE Radio. And special thanks to Report for America for hosting this event with NPR News. Again, if you missed our first discussion with funders who are supporting this work, go back and listen. You can find it on my podcast or at nprnews.org. Thank you for listening and watching.